So today, both of us are together in a rare video where we're actually going to be answering your questions.
Yeah, we got a ton of questions, which is great on YouTube, and we always love talking cameras and photography, so some of the questions that we get more often we figured we would address here in the video.
Yeah, so we just picked 6 questions, and maybe we'll do this more if you guys are interested in something like this. But we're going to go through 6 different things, and these are questions that we get on and off, and they're good questions, and some of them are things that, you know, as a veteran photographer, you don't think that somebody who's just starting out wouldn't know, but maybe they wouldn't.
Right, so let's have some fun, let's answer your questions, and let's get started.
All right. So the first question we got was, somebody was a little confused by the different modes on your camera. So when I mean the modes, you'll either have a dial on the top of your camera, or there'll be something in the settings where you'll have things like auto, P, AV, TV, manual. So these are little settings that you have to go through, and sometimes you may not know what they mean and what the differences are.
Yeah, one thing you want to make sure you do is get out of auto. Auto basically is you're letting your camera do all the work for you, and if you want to grow as a photographer and get more creative and take more control, you want to get out of auto. So you want to get into the AV, TV, and maybe even manual modes more
So
often.
one of the questions we got is, now, so those are the creative modes, but there's also P. Every camera has it. What is the mode P?
P is basically auto, but with a little more control. So typically when you're in auto, you really can't change much. You can't change the exposure compensation. The flash is automatic. There's a lot of things that the camera just won't let you do. It's like an AI thing. It just kind of takes over and takes the pictures for you. Putting it in P basically is the same thing as auto. The camera's doing all the work for you, getting everything set the way that it thinks you want to take the picture, but then you also have the option to override some things. You can change the exposure compensation, you can change the aperture or shutter speed on your own. It gives you a little bit more control.
Do you ever use it?
No.
I don't either. I don't think my camera's ever, any camera I've ever owned has ever been in P mode. I don't think it's a useful mode to have on the camera, but I guess, I mean, if you use it, put a comment in, because I'd like to see when you use it and why you might use this mode, but it's definitely not something that I ever use or you ever use.
No, I've never used it.
Okay, so the other modes are manual, which basically you have complete control of the camera, and we use that mode, I would say, more often than not when we're shooting off a tripod, and usually at night when we want to control exposures and things like that. But other than those situations, or if you're in a situation where the lighting is not going to change, unless you're shooting in like a wedding hall or something like that. But for the most part, what mode are we in?
We're almost always in aperture priority, which is AV. We can basically, the starting point for what you want to create, what kind of image you want to create, is what the look of it's going to be, how it's going to be composed, the framing, and the overall look. And you have the most control over that by controlling the aperture. The aperture basically being the opening in the lens that allows different amounts of light in. And by opening or closing that, you can not only allow different amounts of light in, but you can also control the depth of field, how much of your image is in focus. So a small aperture like 16 is going to give you a really small opening in your lens, but it's going to keep everything in focus, or more area in focus, from the foreground to the background. And a wide open aperture, if you see a lens that has like a 1.4 aperture, it's going to have a very thin depth of field, and you're going to basically only have one part of your photograph in focus. You maybe want to take a portrait and get a picture of somebody where everything else behind them is blurred out. There's something distracting behind them, you want to blur everything out. A wide open aperture like that, it's a great way to control your image.
Right, so when you have the camera in AV mode, you're basically controlling the aperture, and the camera is deciding on the shutter speed.
Right.
So your ISO you set, you control your focus and all of that, and you tell the camera what the aperture is, and depending on how much light you're letting in or not letting in, it's going to adjust your shutter speed. So you have to be mindful of your shutter speed. Now, what is TV?
TV is where you control the shutter speed. So basically the reason that you would want to do that is in certain situations, if you want the look of your photograph to be a certain way. If you have something where you're shooting sports or something fast motion and you want to freeze that motion, you want to make sure you have a nice fast shutter speed, you want to control it that way. Or if you want to blur motion, if you want to get maybe a half-second or 1-second exposure to blur some movement, or a longer exposure to get waterfalls or something like that, you're going to want to control the shutter speed to get the exact length of exposure that you want for that.
Right. And an example of when I use TV is when I'm shooting a panning shot. So I want to set my shutter speed at maybe 1/30th of a second.
Right.
Maybe a car going by or something that's moving, and I want my shutter speed to be able to be repeatable every single shot. I don't care what the aperture is so much. So what happens in that scenario is I'll keep my shutter speed locked and the aperture will change depending on the light coming into the camera. So they're kind of the opposite, AV and TV, but they both, are useful tools, and they make it a little easier than using manual mode.
Right, because when you're controlling the aperture, the camera is, based on what your exposure is, your camera is controlling the shutter speed, and when you're controlling the shutter speed, your camera is going to control the aperture. So depending on what it is that you want to control in each situation is going to be the mode that you're in.
Yep. Okay, so let's go to the next question. Okay, so I'm not a numbers guy. I'm not sure about these things always with the math, but he is. So what is a stop of light? Somebody asked us, when you say I went down 2 stops of light, or I moved my, opened up a stop, what does that mean?
So stop of light is basically a way that photographers have of identifying and measuring how much light is coming in or out of the camera. Basically what one stop represents is twice or half the amount of light compared to the stop next to it. So for aperture, for the opening in your lens, it's basically measured in 1.4, 2, 2.8. You've seen these little numbers and you see them on the lenses. 4.0, 5.6. Jumping from one measurement to the next either halves or doubles your amount of light. So the same thing works for shutter speed. If you're shooting at 1/500th of a second and you change your shutter speed to 1/250th of a second, you're basically cutting your shutter speed. You're doubling your shutter speed, actually. It's going to be a longer shutter speed. You're doubling the amount of light that goes in. So to kind of put it in perspective, the way to get, let's say you have your exposure set, and your exposure is going to be 1/500th of a second at f4. And you say, you know what, I want to have a faster shutter speed. I want to freeze motion. So you go from 1/500th of a second to 1/1000th of a second. So you're cutting in half the amount of light that's hitting your sensor. So that's one stop of light by cutting it in half. Well, by doing that, you need to compensate on the other end on your aperture by allowing more light in to get the same even exposure. So you're going to have to open up your lens by one stop. You're going from 4.0 to 2.8. Basically is going to allow the same amount of light in. So once you have your head wrapped around what that is, and going from one measurement to the next, how many stops you have, and we'll do that very often when shooting with like neutral density filters. And you say, okay, my exposure is this. I'm going to add a 10-stop neutral density filter on. Now you have to do the math and figure out if my exposure was going to be 1/250th of a second, what's my exposure going to be now that I'm subtracting 10 stops of light, which is a lot of light. What's my exposure going to be? So you kind of have to wrap your head around it. Once you do, it's very easy.
Right. So I could never explain it, but it is something that you will learn by doing, and you will start to understand, how ISO, shutter speed, and aperture affect the amount of light coming into your lens and how it all works. But an example of that would be like my camera stops at 1/4000th of a second at the fast end.
Right.
So if when I see some cameras like yours might stop at 1/8000th of a second, even though it's 4,000 difference there, that's one stop of light because it's doubling.
Right.
But down at the other end, 1.4 to 2.8 is a little bit of a difference numerically, but that's also a stop of light.
Also a stop of light.
Okay. All right. I don't know if that helps you. Hopefully his explanation helps you. Okay, next question.
So another question is image stabilization. How useful is it? When do you use it? When do you not use it? A lot of lenses now have image stabilization or vibration reduction, whatever the manufacturer is calling it. Basically what it is there's a gyroscope inside your lens that kind of like allows your lens elements to float and will actually reduce the amount of motion. If you're holding your camera by hand, even if you're holding it steady, you're moving a little bit, you're going to get some camera shake. The image stabilization basically offsets that and allows you to shoot slower shutter speeds than you would normally be able to shoot handheld.
But you don't always want to use it. And so a time when you would not want to use it, it sounds great in theory. I'll always be able to shoot a slower shutter speed. Everything's going to be nice and smooth. That's assuming your camera's moving. But when you have your camera on a tripod and it's perfectly still, and now you have the movement inside the lens, you're going to get a blurry image. So when you have your camera on a tripod, you want to make sure you turn off your image stabilization on your lens.
Right. Otherwise, it's going to be trying to find movement where there's no movement, and then basically in turn creating its own movement based on that. So
Right.
you get a blurry image on a tripod wondering, I'm on a tripod, why is my image blurry? Turn the image stabilization off.
Well, I've done that more than once. I'm sure we all have.
Yep.
I mean, it's one of those things you just forget, or you'll be using a tripod and then you forget you have image stabilization and don't turn it back on.
Right.
But it's just something you'll get used to, and depending on the lens you have. Now, let me ask you this, and I'm just curious. All these new mirrorless cameras are coming out with InBody Stabilization.
Yep.
Do you need to turn that on and off, or does that somehow know when you're on a tripod or not?
I would think it's going to know when you're on a tripod. I would think it's going to be
Okay.
more intuitive to kind of feel the motion. I don't know. I haven't gotten my mirrorless camera with image stabilization yet because it's on back order, but we'll see.
I don't have a plan for one yet, so we'll see what happens. But from what I understand, the InBody is really great.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how it works. So if you know how that works, drop a comment.
Yeah.
Next question. One of our most popular videos on this channel was about the Viltrox Speed Booster. If you don't know what a speed booster is, it lets you use a full frame lens on a crop sensor mirrorless camera.
Right.
So in our application, we were able to use, Eric had a big bag of EF Canon lenses that we were able to adapt to the Canon M50s that we're using, for these videos. And, but it's not for every lens.
Right. So basically what would happen is with a crop sensor, you're basically getting a smaller part of the image circle in your image. So if you're shooting, let's say at 24 millimeters on the wide end of your zoom lens, you're shooting at 24 millimeters on your full frame, you're getting 24 millimeters. If you adapt that with the regular adapter to a crop sensor like the M50, you're basically going to get a smaller part of that image. So you're going to get something that's more equivalent to like a 36 millimeter, and you're not able to then utilize the full wide angle.
So basically what it does is it lets you use your lens at its natural focal length. So if you have a 50 millimeter lens, you put it on a crop sensor camera with a speed booster, you're going to be able to get a 50 millimeter field of view,
Right.
basically.
So, yeah, there's physics involved, but basically what's happening is you're getting whatever lens you have, you're getting that lens. If it's a 50 millimeter 1.4 lens that you're adapting to a crop sensor body, you're getting a 50 millimeter 1.4 lens. Some people will say it's a 48 millimeter
It's off by a
1.6
little
lens,
bit.
but it's close enough to where you're not really going to see a difference, and you're able to now utilize the benefits of having whatever focal length that is and maybe a wider aperture.
And it also lets more light into the camera.
Exactly.
But the question that people ask us, that we get constantly asked, can this lens be used with a speed booster? If it's a lens that's made for a crop sensor camera, you don't want to use a speed booster. You want to use lenses that are made for full frame cameras.
Right.
So in Nikon, that would be FX lenses. In Canon, it would be EF lenses.
Right.
I'm not sure what Sony calls their full frame lenses, but those are the situations where you'd want to use a speed booster. When you have a crop sensor body and a full frame lens, and you want to marry them together to use the lens at its natural focal length.
Right, and you use the speed booster in lieu of using an adapter. So it's not like you're mounting that on top of an adapter. That becomes your adapter.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that cleared it up. So we got a couple of questions. Some people asking us, what's the best way to clean a lens? And it sounds so simple, but is it grab your t-shirt and wipe the front of the lens, or is there a better way to do it?
Right, so I always carry a microfiber cloth with me, and something that we've been using for the past several years, which is great, is a lens pen.
Yeah. There is nothing worse than getting back home and you took this beautiful image and you know it, and you open it up in the computer and there's spots on the image. There's water spots, or there's some sort of smear, or there's something, your lens had something on it. So you had a dirty lens and you took the image, and now there's nothing you can do about it unless you want to spend a ton of time in the computer removing spots and trying to fix things. So we've talked about the lens pen before, but this isn't even in my bag. This is in my pocket. I keep this in my pocket. As soon as I take my camera out of the bag, this goes in my pocket, and I am constantly wiping dust. It's got the little charcoal tip, and then it's got the brush on the other end, and these things are indispensable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always clean my gear before I go on, especially a photo trip. I spend, a couple of hours at home, with the microfiber cloth and the cleaning solution, cleaning off my stuff as much as I possibly can. But I don't really need to do it, because every time I get to where I'm going, I pull my camera out for the first time. I'm out in the daylight, in the sunshine, and I look at it, and it looks like it has been through a war. There's just smears and dust all over it and everything. without a doubt, every single time. Anytime I look at my lens, I see a spot, I see anything on there. If it's just dust, I'll use the brush it off, no problem. If there's a spot that won't come off with that, the little charcoal tip, rub it on there and then brush it off. Spotless. Works every single time.
Right, so it comes with this little microfiber cloth, and this is what typically you would used to use on a camera lens, right? So you have a microfiber cloth, but I've found over the years, especially when you're shooting in damp conditions or by the beach when there's a chance of salt or, you know, who knows, these just smear things.
Yeah.
And, you know, the lens pen actually comes in this cloth. This stays in my bag. I don't use it ever.
Right.
This is what you want. Get one of these. All right, so there were 6 questions there, but we have one bonus question. And it was an interesting one because this is something that I did when I first started getting into photography. Do you put a UV filter on the end of your camera lens?
That's a great question.
And if you do, why would you? And if you don't, why not?
Every single time you buy a lens, and it happens to us every single time we buy a lens now, they ask you if you want a filter. They ask you if you want a UV filter. I've never bought a UV filter. I've never put one on my lens.
See, I used to.
The only reason you would want to, basically, is to protect your lens.
Right.
You know, you're buying a lens, it's fairly expensive, and you want to make sure you protect that front glass element. And, you know, there's plenty of times when you're in a situation, you know, you're holding your camera at your side or it's hanging off of you and it bangs into things. You want to make sure that it's protected. So you still want to be very careful with what you have, but basically what you're doing is, especially if you're buying a more expensive lens, you're taking an expensive lens and you're basically covering it with another piece of glass.
Right.
And, you know, whether or not that glass is, you know, as good as the lens itself, you could,
Right,
not
you put a
significantly,
cheap
but-
UV filter on a $2,000 lens.
Right.
It doesn't maybe make sense.
Right, and then if you want to put another, let's say you're going to use a circular polarizer and you screw it onto the front of the UV filter, you can get some vignette, you know, in your image, and you can, now you're adding another lens element, another element of glass in front of your lens.
Right. So, I mean, I think instead of using a UV filter on your camera to protect your lens, I think just always leave your lens hood on. I mean, I always leave my lens hood on my lens, even if I don't need it, even if it's nighttime and I'm not worried about it. Because there are so many times, if you looked at my lens hoods, they're all banged up and, you know, there's marks and all over them. And and actually that night where my bag flew open, and my 16 to 35 Nikon lens, it's a $1,000 lens, went flying out of my bag and crashed on the concrete. The lens hood broke, and because it was on there, I didn't worry about the glass was fine.
Right.
So I think just a good lens hood would be enough to protect your lens.
Yeah, I use it all the time. It's definitely much better to protect your lens with that than it is with a UV filter. Plus, with the lens hood, you're using it as a lens hood. Any stray light that might get in there, if it's raining a little bit, it'll protect your lens. Much better than a UV filter.
Okay, so these are just a few questions you guys asked, and you know, let us know if you like this type of video. It's kind of just general photography knowledge, and there's really no rhyme or reason to it, but it might be interesting just to sit down and, you know, maybe there's something in here that you weren't sure about that we covered. So, you know, hopefully it's helpful for you.
Yeah, and if there's anything specific you want us to even make a video about, you know, some of the videos we've done here have been birthed by questions that you guys have. You know, that was basically the nexus of it was, you know, we've seen this question over and over. Let's do a video about just that. So if you any questions, anything you guys would love to see a video about, put that in the comments below also.
Okay, so we will see you in the next one.